Okay, now for our interview with Brian Bentley. One of the big questions we're faced with right now as we look at the response to the George Floyd and we look at the Black Lives Matter movement and so on is if we just look at the George Floyd situation, do we have a problem here in America with police brutality, or do we have a problem with police racism?
That's an interesting question, and I think we have a problem with both. And when you talk about racism, people usually try to put it into simple terms or, make it real simplistic, but it isn't. And police brutality also is a complex issue. With George Floyd, I mean, we watched someone get murdered right in front of us, and it was almost as if we were there. We see these videos every day. We saw them, just nonstop. So it was almost as if we were there and we were standing there watching. There is an issue with police brutality. Police officers, and it's due mainly to the nature of the job. It's a violent job.
Yeah, I don't think many people doubt that there's police brutality. I think whether it's racially motivated or not, I think is a real question. The George Floyd video is horrifying to watch. Actually, I thought you made a really interesting observation on another interview that I watched of you, where you pointed out that, hey, when a guy says that he can't breathe, the police mindset should change from being full-blown arrest mode into being concerned for somebody's health. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. So you're dealing with somebody who's supposed to be treated as an innocent person, albeit subject to arrest. But there needs to be a mindset among police that, hey, we got to be concerned about the health and safety of everyone, even the people that we're arresting. And when somebody is indicating to you that they can't breathe, there ought to be something trigger that goes on in your head. And those cops, we didn't see that trigger go off at all.
No, we didn't. And in fact, the incident with George Floyd, where someone goes into medical distress, is not uncommon with police officers. Police officers deal with that probably a couple of times a week, where you'll arrest somebody, and just because of the nature of the arrest, it's very frightening. It's adrenaline's going on, and people have medical emergencies, and so that's not uncommon. What's uncommon is that they ignored it. Not ignored it, but they also contributed to it by putting this knee on his neck. So you can see there wasn't any concern, and not just concern, but there seemed to be some type of gratification from it, some kind of emotional release from him having his foot on his neck, hands in his pocket, and he seemed to be enjoying it. And to mention, to go back to what you were saying, is it racial or is it just police brutality? I worked with some really violent cops when I worked with LAPD and Southwest Division. And I wrote in my book that it's really difficult to tell when you see a white officer who beats a black person. You see another black officer who does the same thing. It's what's their motivation? I've heard black cops say, well, you know what, that person, I was pissed off because they're bringing the race down. So I was angry at that. And then you wonder what the motivation is behind the white officers. Now, the reason that I know that there's racism on the department is because I've had I've been really close to a lot of officers, a lot of white officers. And sometimes when you come into the car, they'll tell you, hey, you know what? You need to look out for so-and-so, because we had a conversation and they were throwing the N-word around, and you should just be very careful of that person. And they'll tell me, yeah, I had to put that person straight. I've heard that maybe about 6 or 7 times during my career, where I've had white officers warn me about other white officers. And so, that sent an alarm in my head too. I go, what's their motivation for doing what they do?
Mm-hmm. But if we suggest that police brutality is mostly racially based, then you're severely underestimating the amount of police brutality, because the vast amount of police brutality is probably not racially based.
Well, that's like I said, that's hard to address. And
you're the guy who's coming out and saying that, hey, there is a strain among police officers that are addicted to violence. And I want you
Correct.
to talk about that. And I assume this addiction to violence is not addicted to racist violence. It's just an addiction to violence, period.
Right, it is. So when I wrote my first book one time, the story of a South Central Los Angeles police officer, I wrote it about the violence that I saw and experienced on the LAPD. And here's the thing. The thing is, when I wrote the book, when I just described my partners, I did not say what race they were. I described everything else of a former Marine, 6'4", muscular, tattoos, but I did not say whether they were white or black. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to address the violence part of it. But here's the irony of it. The irony of it is that I had white officers come to me and say my book was racial, even though I didn't mention the race. And then I had black officers come to me and say, well, why didn't you tell me the race? Why didn't you mention the race? Because we know it was white people. So, you have that dynamic there. But when I wrote my book and when I speak generally to specifically for towards the violence, because that's one thing you can't deny is that the addiction. I mean, you see it. Officers can't control themselves. You have body cams, right? You have citizens who have cell phones. You have surveillance videos on buildings, but they still go out and they still commit excessive force, knowing that the whole world is watching, and they can't control it. Back when I was a police officer during right before the riots in '91, right after the Rodney King beating, LAPD was hands off. Officers were saying, we're not going to arrest anybody. We're not going to touch anybody. We don't care what the crime rate goes, how it gets. We're not touching anybody. And as a result, the LA County Jail had to close a wing of the jail because LAPD wasn't arresting anybody. However, there was a group of officers that I worked with that didn't care. They couldn't stop. They went out and it was business as usual. They were roughing up gang members. They were very physical, and they never stopped. It didn't matter what the public's opinion was. It didn't matter what the ramifications would have been. They conducted business as usual because it was something they felt they had to do.
So this addiction to violence that you speak about, that you saw in your time with the LAPD, and I presume have also done a lot of research on. Let's start with this question. Do you see the prevalence of that among white officers being any different than the prevalence of that addiction among black officers?
Well, what we've seen in Atlanta, the officers that were fired, they were black. The thing is that you don't have as many black officers to run that pool and do statistics on. Most of the officers that you see on the LAPD in the black community are white. There's not a lot of black officers on patrol, so you can't really get an accurate count. So of course you're going to see more.
What is the breakdown of LAPD? Do you know?
I do. I know that, which is interesting that you brought this up, but the Police Protective League is doing this campaign where there's a lot of diversity in the department, and that there's 9.9% African Americans on the job. That comes out to be 962 black officers. Out of that 962, that's spread out through the whole department, through the Valley, through Metro, all over. And there are less than 300 black officers on patrol. So you don't see any. I live in South LA. I haven't seen a black officer in my neighborhood in 8 months. So looking at
why do you think there's so few black officers? I mean, you say it's 10%, which I mean that is ballpark the percentage in the LA population, right? African Americans.
That is, but you can't go on that, because when I was on the job in 1990, the department was 13.8% black, and the population in LA was 11. So I don't know where they got into a board meeting somewhere and decided that we're going to change it. But even when I was in the department, you still didn't see a lot of black officers on patrol. And having
wait a minute, you made a kind of a flippant comment there about going into a board meeting and changing something. What are you talking about?
Well, it's a concerted effort not to have black officers on the job.
What do you? That's pretty bold assertion. What do you base that on?
I base it on because I've talked to people in recruiting, and they go out and there are a lot of black applicants, and you cannot tell me that all the applicants are not qualified and that they can only get 5 black qualified people to come into the police academy. And I know somewhere they had to make the decision that they're only going to have this percentage in the class. And basically, they're going on what the percentage of the population is. That's not the
Well,
right
I mean,
way.
does the LAPD practice affirmative action?
I don't know. I've not been behind the scenes. I don't know that. All I could say is that, well, all I could say is what I've heard. And they're trying to keep it at the level of the population of blacks, but that's not right, and that's not productive. Because
but who's trying to keep it that way?
Well,
the chief of police, the mayor.
Well, no, I don't know who goes behind and who actually makes that decision. That's a question you should have asked Jamie McBride on how they came about those numbers with the how many blacks.
Well, but perhaps the numbers just come out as they are. The people apply. Everybody's free to apply. The best qualified get hired, and the less qualified don't. And then it winds up with the percentage that it winds up in. You're acting as if somebody's paying attention and manipulating the numbers to make sure there's only a certain percentage of blacks. And that's a very strong assertion. You're saying that they're violating Title VII of Civil Rights Act by discriminating against blacks.
Well, when I was in the academy, they did have a policy that they would not even start an academy class unless they had a certain number of a certain percentage of blacks in that class, certain percentage of Hispanics, and a certain percentage of whites. That was a fact. I knew when I was in there. I can't say what's going on now because I'm not a part of it, but I can tell you for sure.
There had to be at least a minimum percentage, you're saying?
Right. There's a minimum percentage that you had to have, and they would not start a class if they could not meet those percentages.
So that's affirmative action. They were intentionally looking at people's race and making sure that they had a certain percentage of black and Hispanic candidates. They were applying affirmative action.
Right. And so now that the 9.9% is not an effective number. 962 black officers and having only less than 300 in the field is not productive, especially when the crisis that we're having now is generated by what's going on in the black community.
Yeah. Well, look, I agree with you. I would love to see a greater percentage of African Americans as police officers, because even though 10% is in the ballpark of the percentage of African Americans in Los Angeles, the truth is there's far more crime in the black community. And so there's far more officers in the black community. And it would be nice if a larger percentage of them were of a similar background.
And you're right. The statistics for the crime in the black community is a lot higher. And that goes to what I've been saying as far as the mindset of police officers. When I was in the academy, we had a choice of where to go. We had three choices of where we wanted to go. Everyone chose 77th, Southeast, and Newton, which were areas in the black community. And a lot of the recruits were from other states. They were from Iowa, they were from Montana, and everybody wanted to go to 77th and Southeast. And I asked a lot of them, I'm like, why do you want to go there? And they're like, because we heard that's where the action is. So everybody knows the statistics, where the crime is, where the action is, and that's where they want to go because they want to be in where the action is. It's not because they want to help solve domestic violence or be mentors to kids. They want to go where, where the action is. And I mean, I understand that. But the thing is you have that mentality and you go into the community and you want to go in like a cowboy. You're not thinking about what the people who are innocent, who aren't involved in gangs, and the kids who get stopped randomly because these officers are from some other place and they don't understand, really understand what a gang member looks like. And so that's where you have the hostility in the black community. And you have these officers who are aggressive, and they go into the black community and it's accepted. Where you live in West LA, you can't go in there and just randomly stop people. You'd be thrown out the division and you would have problems. But in South LA, you can pretty much do anything you want to do, and there isn't any problem with it, and you don't get in trouble for it.